say to the Lord, you are my God. My happiness lies in you alone. My happiness lies in you alone. You are the center of my life. I will always praise you. I will always service you. I will always keep you in my sight. I will bless the Lord who gives me counsel, who even at night directs my heart. I keep the Lord ever in my sight. Since He is at my right hand, I shall stand firm. You are the center of my life. I will always praise you. I will always service you. I will always keep you in my sight. So my heart rejoices, my soul is glad. Even in safety shall my body rest. You will not leave my soul among the dead, nor let it you are the center of my life. I will always praise you. I will always service you. I will always keep you in my sight.
Good evening and welcome to Catholic Conversations, hosted by St. Monica Catholic Community. My name is Delis Alejandro, Pastoral Associate at the parish. Here at St. Monica's, October is Catholic Social Teaching Month, and this month's Catholic Conversations all month will feature presentations by men and women who serve in various agencies and ministries throughout the diocese and even across the country that embody the principles of Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching is an essential element of our faith. It was developed from scriptural tradition and reflections by our bishops and popes and important writers of the church over the centuries. They are the values and principles that guide us as Catholic people as we put our faith into action. The 7 principles are the life and dignity of the human person, the call to community, participation in family, preferential option for the poor, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, and the care for God's creation. We also include in that group the rights and responsibilities, which we'll be focusing on a bit tonight. The Catholic tradition teaches that human dignity can be protected and a healthy community can be developed only if human rights are protected and responsibilities are met. Therefore, every person has a fundamental right to life and a right to those things required for human decency, including work, living conditions, food, water. Tonight, our presenter, Linda Dakin-Grimm, is here with us tonight, and she's going to share with us her experiences with issues of human rights at the border. Here to welcome our presenter and also provide us with some guidelines for tonight's presentation is Associate Director of Outreach and Pastoral Care at St. Monica, Christine Garrity.
Thanks, Dallas. Good evening, everyone, and we are so glad that you are making the time to be here with us tonight. It's my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Linda Dakin-Grimm. She is a leader, and we have the opportunity to follow her example. And she's following Christ, and so it's a good model to follow. So on a pro bono basis, Linda has represented more than 75 unaccompanied children and families who must navigate the U.S. immigration system and adjust to life in Los Angeles. She's also the lead counsel in several successful class action lawsuits against the current administration for violations of United States law. A senior consulting partner at Milbank LLP, Linda received her BA from Yale, her JD from Harvard Law School, and a master's in theology from LMU. She is currently a 2020-21 fellow of Harvard University's Advanced Leadership Initiative, which means that she's calling in to us from Boston tonight. Linda's first book, Dignity and Justice: Welcoming the Stranger at Our Border, was published by Orbis Press earlier this year and is available on orbisbooks.com, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other bookstores. So before I turn it over to Linda, just a reminder that we really want to hear your questions. We want you to engage, but put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. So welcome, Linda. We're glad you're here.
Thanks very much, Christine. It is an honor to be part of this series. Tonight, I'm going to talk about migration and the Catholic response to migration. Migration is a complicated issue, and it always has been in the world. Tonight, we're going to talk, though, about how for Catholics, some migrants in some situations present a life issue. The news in this country these days focuses mainly on poor migrants coming to the southern border. But the US has gone through many phases of migration, starting with the first Europeans who came to this country, the Spanish in the 1500s, the British, Dutch, and French who first arrived in the 1600s. And the forced, oh, Gary, yeah, if you wouldn't mind if my husband was going to put up slides in the background, thank you. The forced migration of African slaves that took place in this same time period. All of the European settlers came to this country without asking for permission before they came, usually to escape something they wanted to leave behind. People from China and other parts of Asia came to work here in the 1800s, but they faced horrific persecution and violent resistance to being allowed to stay. Chinese immigrants were not actually allowed to become US citizens until 1943, even though barriers to remaining and to coming into the country continued for another 20 years or so after that. Today, migrants are demonized as lawbreakers, criminals, and invaders. How do people who are hostile to migrants justify their hostility? Some say, these people have broken the law, or they say, my family came here the right way, following the rules. Well, I want to ask them, what was the law that your family followed? Do you know what rules they had to satisfy? Do you know the law or its history? Were those people your ancestors running for their lives? And did they ask permission before they came, or did they just get on a boat and assume they'd be allowed in when they got here? Another perspective that some people offer is, well, the US, this is a special place and it's meant to have a white European and Christian culture. Where does that unhistorical idea come from? Another idea is that if we welcome any more migrants, we will lose something that we have, or our children or grandchildren might not get something that we want for them. Well, here are some questions that I'd like to pose for you to think about as I talk this evening. The first is, what is a human being? Do I really believe that every human is a precious child of God, created in God's image and likeness? Is an unborn human more worthy of love and compassion than an already born child? What about a child born in another country? Is someone who's born in this country more worthy than a person born in another country? And As a human person, do I have obligations or duties to my fellow human beings that go along with rights? Do my obligations extend to all human beings or just to some? And now, speaking as a Catholic, does my faith impose upon me any particular obligations to my fellow humans? To all or just to some? Are they limited to the people in my family, my neighborhood, my country? Are my obligations to other people limited by the accident of where I happen to have been born? And again, must I care for only people in my city or my country? And finally, do my Christian obligations end at the border? And if you really think they do, which border? The border that exists today? The border that existed 100 years ago? The border changes. Now, I want to tell you the story of one boy, one of my first clients. And then I want to tell you in the course of that, I want to try and explain a little bit about US law. And then I'm going to talk about how, as Catholics, we are called to think about questions like the ones I just posed and about migrating people. So this is Gilberto. It's a little skinny picture, but he was a little skinny kid at that point. He was born in Guatemala in 2000. He doesn't remember his mother, who abandoned him, and his father when Gilberto was only about a year old. For the first 5 years of his life, Gilberto lived with his father, his paternal grandparents, and his uncle outside of Guatemala City. His father, Santiago, left Guatemala when Gilberto was 5 years old to find work to support his young son and his parents. Gilberto remained behind. Santiago is one of the million or so Los Angelinos who don't have permission to live here, but who do the jobs other people reject, like washing cars, working in restaurant kitchens, and taking care of our gardens, homes, and children. Gilberto's dad kept in touch with him, but Gilberto never wanted to make his dad feel bad, so he usually didn't say how bad things really were. Gilberto's grandfather was murdered when Gilberto was 7 years old. He and his wife had gone to a neighborhood ATM for some cash, just a small amount of cash. A gunman shot the grandfather while they were walking home. No police came. The despairing family went to the police station to beg for help, but as is very typical, the police never investigated and the killer was never found. After that, Gilberto's family joined an evangelical Christian church. Gilberto's uncle Isaac eventually gave up his factory job and became its pastor. The church met at the grandparents' house where Gilberto lived, and the loving church community became the center of young Gilberto's life. When he was 9 years old, he was baptized in a river by his uncle. That's his uncle there on the picture on the left, surrounded by his church friends. Gilberto remains proud that he was baptized only after he had demonstrated that he understood what he was doing and that the baptism was his own choice. As Gilberto grew, he became more involved in the church and increasingly public with his faith. He joined an acting troupe of young people who taught the youngest children to surrender their lives to Jesus Christ and to avoid the gang life. The troupe performed Christian skits and versions of folk tales like Little Red Riding Hood, and they posted videos on YouTube. That's Gilberto on the left, and it's also him on the right, dressed as Granny, the wolf pretending to be Granny. MS-13 is one of two dominant gangs that terrorize ordinary people in Guatemala. Its main rival is Mara 18, sometimes called the 18th Street Gang. The two gangs fight each other for territory in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. They sell drugs and they dominate local people. Today, both MS-13 and MATA-18 are international, but they were originally formed on the streets of Los Angeles, California in the 1980s by young men who had escaped from decades of civil wars in Central America, only to encounter the gang culture of the Crips, the Bloods, and the Mexican La M that was then prevailing in the poorest areas of LA. The US exported MS-13 and MATA-18 back to Central America when it deported members of these gangs in the 1990s. MS-13 became increasingly angry about the anti-gang and outreach programs at Gilberto's little church because the programs interfered with their agenda. They retaliated brutally, both by trying to force Gilberto as the pastor's nephew to abandon church and work for them, and by terrorizing the entire church. From about age 10, Gilberto experienced being beaten, threatened, stalked, and ultimately held at gunpoint, a situation he escaped by mere chance when the alley he had been pulled into flooded with people. Gang members burst into prayer meetings, and they disrupted church services by throwing furniture and terrorizing people. The kids in the church found a litter of puppies with their paws cut off, bleeding to death on the church doorstep that they immediately understood to be symbolic of themselves. In early 2014, MS-13 members shot and killed the father of one of Gilberto's friends. Soon after that, when Gilberto was walking home from school, he came upon the body of a dead boy about his own age. When Gilberto was 13, he was grabbed in an alley and held at gunpoint by 4 MS-13 members. He told them that his faith in Jesus would not allow him to sell drugs for them. And as I said, he escaped by mere chance. But he knew after that experience that he would have to leave Guatemala if he wanted to stay alive. On the journey to the US by himself, Gilberto was held captive in Mexico by a coyote he met who extorted money from his father. After Santiago wired money, Gilberto was let go. He reached the border in Texas, where he was again held captive, locked in a small motel room on the Texas side of the border for about a month, while criminals extorted his father for more money. Ultimately, the Texas Highway Patrol found Gilberto wandering disoriented on the highway. They arrested the skinny young man at gunpoint, handcuffed him, and took him to their station where he collapsed and was taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital. Upon release, the police turned Gilberto over to ICE, which sent him to a detention center for migrant children in Houston. Eventually, Gilberto was released to his father in Los Angeles, who promised to make sure that he enrolled in school and that his father would bring him to every immigration court hearing. In LA, Gilberto lived with his father, his new stepmother, and their 2 young daughters. He enrolled in high school and joined a youth group at the family's evangelical church in Sun Valley. He felt safe, and he was deeply grateful to be able to attend church and school without fear. He and his dad knew they needed to find a lawyer, but they couldn't afford one. After months of searching, the agency Kids in Need of Defense, known as KIND, finally agreed to find a pro bono lawyer for Gilberto. When he finally came to me, he thought his problems were behind him. He was stunned to learn that the legal bases to remain in the US are narrow, very difficult to prove, and that the burden of proof of all of the facts of the case would be entirely on him. The first thing Gilberto learned was the complicated process he would have to go through to navigate to get permission to remain in the US. These are some of the agencies, just some of the agencies that immigrants must navigate. He learned that the process for him would involve going through two systems at the same time. In immigration court, a federal court, that's EOIR, it's about the fourth one down, he would have to plead to the charges against him. It sounds just like criminal law, like you hear on TV, except the court system, the immigration court system, is considered a civil court, even if you're held in detention, which means only that you're not entitled to a lawyer if you can't afford one. At the same time that he had to go to the immigration court, he would go to a different federal agency called U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, that's the top one there on the list, to try and persuade officers there to grant him a humanitarian status to remain in the country. USCIS is a federal agency under the Department of Homeland Security. The other two agencies that were created in the year 2001 after the terrorist events in New York and Washington are ICE and US Customs and Border Protection. So Gilberto is in the middle of what are called removal proceedings in immigration court. And there, unless he could prove that he had earned somewhere else a legal basis to stay, the immigration judge would order him removed and ICE would deport him. At the same time, Gilberto could go to US Citizenship and Immigration Service and try to apply for either asylum or another humanitarian status called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. If he obtained either of those statuses, he could go back to the judge and ask to have the case ended. In immigration court, the charges against Gilberto were simple. The charges were, you're not a US citizen and you didn't have permission to come here before you came. Remember the Europeans who came without asking permission? Also, today, although most of what we hear about are immigrants coming across the southern border, more than 50% of the undocumented people who live in the country didn't come across the southern border. They flew in on airplanes and overstayed tourist visas. Gilberto had to stand before a judge and admit or deny those two facts, that he wasn't a US citizen and he didn't have permission to come, in response to the judge's question, how do you plead? By admitting the facts, and he had to admit them because they were true, he would be conceding that the US had the right to deport him if he couldn't get some relief like asylum. But Gilberto didn't know what or where the immigration court was, or USCIS for that matter, much less how to put together an application for some kind of status. All he knew was that he had suffered terribly in Guatemala, that his life was in jeopardy there, and that he needed to be with his father. He had assumed that that would be enough. It isn't enough. The term asylum doesn't mean what Gilberto had assumed and what most people think. Desperate people fleeing really bad circumstances, seeking safety. Our country simply does not grant asylum to most of the people that we know have suffered terribly and who we believe are genuinely fleeing persecution, poverty, wars, atrocities, famines. And this has been the case since long before the current administration. The current administration is not following existing law, so it's become much worse, but the problem preceded the current administration. So Gilberto learned that asylum is only available to people who can prove that they experienced past serious persecution in their homeland, or they have a credible fear of persecution if they are returned, and you usually prove that by showing past persecution. But that's not enough. The particular persecution you suffered You have to prove that it was on account of one of 5 specific grounds: race, religion, national origin, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most of the people who come to the US can't do this. They can prove that they experienced severe persecution, but they can't prove that the motive of the persecutors was one of these boxes. Gilberto was dismayed to learn that to qualify for asylum, he had to provide actual evidence of the motives of his persecutors, the reasons why they came after him. And if he couldn't prove that his persecutors hurt him because of one of those 5 grounds, he would lose. He was confounded to find out that he also had to prove that his own country, Guatemala, couldn't or wouldn't protect him, and then he couldn't just move somewhere else in Guatemala to be safe. He had no idea how to do any of these things. Gilberto learned that asylum is never available to people who were severely persecuted, but for some other reason than the 5 I listed. And he didn't understand that people who suffer for reasons other than persecution, like famine or natural disaster or just severe poverty or lack of medical care for their condition, things that arguably don't involve persecution, those people never qualify for asylum, no matter how severe their suffering. Ultimately, Gilberto sought asylum on the basis that he had experienced severe persecution on account of his evangelical Christian faith. He submitted evidence that included his own testimony, a psychological report by an expert documenting his trauma, written testimony from his uncle, the pastor, and his LA pastor, photographs of his anti-gang activity, the skits, YouTube videos, letters from his uncle to the police begging for protection. Gilberto's uncle, the pastor, testified in writing that Gilberto had been persecuted because of his faith. We submitted extensive evidence about the conditions in Guatemala and how Guatemala came to be overrun by these gangs, and the conditions that made it impossible for Gilberto to move somewhere else in his own country. And then finally, we submitted a legal brief explaining why Gilberto's story fit within the law. But we knew it was a long shot. We knew his case was a long shot. Religious persecution is very difficult to prove, and the government typically assumes that religion is not the reason you've been persecuted, that even if you weren't religious, the gangs persecute everyone. An asylum officer interviewed Gilberto just after Christmas in 2015. He, as usual, had to bring his own translator, so we brought a volunteer from the Archdiocese of LA. The asylum officer painstakingly questioned Gilberto for about 3 hours, asking about every line of his testimony and that of his uncle and his pastor and his experts. About 3 months later, Gilberto was granted asylum, effective March of 2016. Today, Gilberto is a tall, slim, confident 20-year-old. That is Gilberto being interviewed a couple weeks ago by CBS News. He speaks English fluently, and sometimes he smiles broadly. That's a pretty good smile from Gilberto. He graduated from high school in June 2019. He works at McDonald's right now and is waiting until he turns 21 to enter the Firefighters Academy. After a year with asylum status, he applied to become a lawful permanent resident, which is known as a green card holder. He received his green card in November 2017, and he will be eligible to apply for citizenship next year. So what's the Catholic response to people like Gilberto? And I will tell you, his story is not unique, as horrible as it sounds. The fact that we were able to argue the religious aspect of his life and get asylum on that basis is somewhat unique, but the severe persecution he suffered is not. For most people from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, who seek asylum, the result is not happy like Gilberto's was. So how should we as Catholics respond to the suffering people from other countries? Here, I'm going to tell you, this is the headline and summary of my talk in one slide. When it comes to children and migrants whose lives are in danger or who simply cannot support themselves in the places they come from, the Catholic response, a life issue, is clear. From Pope Leo XIII in the 19th century, Popes Pius XII and John Paul II in the 20th century, and Popes Benedict and Francis in this century, our church has taught that Catholics must welcome and support these migrants, and we must do so even if our country's secular law would turn them away. So I just want to spend a few minutes and then we'll have questions, but I want to talk about how we're supposed to think about these issues. Catholics turn to two sources when wrestling with moral questions. We look to Scripture, of course, but not solely to Scripture. That's a Protestant idea that came about in the Reformation period. Catholics rely on both our God-given reason and revelation, which includes both Scripture and the long-standing teaching of the Church. Those are our sources for moral decision-making. So I'm going to start with a little Scripture. I never thought I would be a Scripture table pounder, but I'm going to start with Scripture. The Bible is a series of stories about migration, starting with Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Floods, famines, various persecutions, and simply the need to find work caused biblical people like Noah, Abraham and Sarah, Jacob, Joseph and his brothers, Moses, Ruth, and eventually the Holy Family itself to migrate. Over and over, the Bible tells us to welcome the stranger. In Exodus, we hear, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." God's command is repeated in Leviticus. "The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." And again in Deuteronomy, you can see the same command. Well, what about Jesus? One of the best places to see that we, Jesus's followers, must welcome the suffering migrant stranger is Jesus's clarion call of God's final judgment in Matthew 25. And this is verse 31 to 46. This is Jesus telling his followers what will happen at the end of days when the Son of Man comes in glory. Jesus says he will separate people one from the other as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. And those at the right hand will inherit the kingdom. Why? And Jesus says, why? Because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. But Jesus tells us the righteous won't understand, and they'll say, well, Lord, when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you? And Jesus will answer them, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. And what about those on the left? Jesus will say to them, depart from me, for I was a stranger and you did not welcome me. And those people will also be confused, and they'll ask, Lord, when did we see you a stranger and not take care of you? And he will answer, truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. So that's the Bible in a bit of a nutshell, but Catholics also look at church teaching. In 1993, Pope John Paul II, St. Pope John Paul II, addressed the existence of something called moral absolutes. Those are things that are always in any circumstance wrong to choose, even if they're feasible. They're things you can do, but for Catholics, they're always wrong. In his encyclical called Veritatis, Splendor, John Paul II wrote that there are certain kinds of specific behavior that are always wrong to choose, and that choosing them involves a moral evil. And he also wrote that Catholics may never choose a moral evil, even if there is a good intention or the belief that some other good will ultimately come from it. That is not the Catholic way. Catholics don't say, for example, it's okay to let a bunch of children be torn from their parents' arms and sent to dangerous, life-threatening situations. We'll cooperate with that because we might get something else we want if we do. Well, what are the moral absolutes John Paul's talking about? Our church teaches that Catholics may never support or formally cooperate with actions that are destructive of human life, even, as I said, if it's in the hope that some other good will come. Where does this come from? It comes from the natural law, an idea that existed before Thomas of Aquinas, but he kind of wrote it all down in a really long, complicated, hard to read way in the 12th or so century. And his thinking underlies much of Catholic moral thought on life issues. According to Aquinas, the first precept of the natural law is that good is to be promoted and evil is to be avoided. Well, that sounds good, but what does it really mean? He tells us the next precept: whatever is a means of preserving human life and of warding off obstacles to life belongs to the natural law. So John Paul II, jumping ahead to 1993, told us that that means participating in, facilitating, or turning one's back on the torture of a human person. Absolutely never. He also told us preserving the family and protecting children are moral absolutes. I know I'm jumping forward and back in history, but I want to take you back for a minute to the late 1800s. Pope Leo XIII, in a document called Sapientia Christiani, Leo wrestled with, what about if I have some obligations to the state and I have some obligations to God? And in Sapientia Christiani, he wrote, Gary's, there we go. It is the high crime indeed to withdraw allegiance from God in order to please men, an act of consummate wickedness to break the laws of Jesus Christ in order to yield obedience to earthly rulers, or under pretext of keeping the civil law to ignore the rights of the church. We ought to obey God rather than men. So Leo taught, and every pope since him has reaffirmed, that if the state's law is contrary to God's law, Catholics must follow God's law. And Leo went further and said that in this case, to resist human law becomes a positive duty, to obey it a crime. Leo also taught that although the right to private property is part of the natural law, the Catholic who has amassed enough to take care of self and family has a duty to use his wealth to support those who do not have enough. And I would suggest to you, this is Linda talking, not Pope Leo, but that means that those of us who have enough have a duty to take care of others, not to advocate for stronger borders to protect our own riches, our culture, or our higher standard of living. 2 more documents and I'll stop. The next one, Pope Pius XII. He wrote just after World War II, after millions of people had become migrants as a result of the events of the war. He wrote this document called Exsul Familia Nazarethana, and I wish it were preached every Sunday. It is the church's highest kind of teaching document. It's called an apostolic constitution, and it's all about migration. Pope Pius XII said that the Holy Family is the model and protector of every migrant. He held them up as people that we can learn from and emulate. And he stated that we must welcome both those people who are afraid of persecution, and by the way, any kind of persecution, not just the 5 boxes that we have in US law, but we also must welcome those who migrate because of want. That means because they can't sustain themselves at home. So Catholics don't demonize people who can't support themselves or their families at home and come here for a better opportunity. We don't call people economic migrants as if that's a bad thing. Pius also taught in that document that the right of a family to be together in a living space is foundational to the natural law. He wrote, "There are people who have been forced by such things as war, unemployment, and hunger to leave their homes and to live in foreign lands. And the natural law itself, no less than devotion to humanity, urges that ways of migration be open to these people." Now, one thing that we hear from people sometimes is, well, the church recognizes that states have a right to protect their borders. Pius wrote about this in this apostolic constitution. He wrote, "The sovereignty of the state, although it must be respected, cannot be exaggerated to the point that access to this land is for inadequate or unjustified reasons denied to needy and decent people from other lands, provided, of course, that the public wealth, considered very carefully, does not forbid this." Now, don't get me wrong. The church supports nation states protecting all of their people for the common good, and that means patrolling their borders. It doesn't mean turning decent people who have need away, and it certainly doesn't mean the kinds of policies that are going on in the country right now. Okay, John Paul II. I'm just going to show you one quote from Veritatis Splendor. You can see there, Pius did predict what we're experiencing. A little bit forward, Gary. The paragraph 80 in Veritatis Splendor. Keep going. Keep going. There it is. Oh, okay. This paragraph that's up on the screen, this John Paul II says in Veritatis Splendor, which is the encyclical that most people look to for the church's teaching on abortion. But it is so much more than that. In this encyclical, Pope John Paul II says, "There are those who say, and why not do evil that some good may come? Their condemnation is just." So what is evil? This is paragraph 80. If you're going to remember any paragraphs from any papal teachings, paragraph 80 from Veritatis Splendor is worth remembering. You can see that he defines what is evil, whatever is hostile to life itself. And then he lists them, whatever is hostile to the integrity of the human person. And that includes abortion in the first paragraph there, but below that, whatever is offensive to human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation. It's right there in the same paragraph. Migration is not a kind of sub-issue or minor issue when we're talking about suffering people who can't sustain themselves. It is a life issue. On the other hand, if the issue is how many models of extraordinary modeling ability should we bring into the country, that's an issue that people might have differing opinions on, and we aren't called in one way or another to have an opinion based on our Catholic faith. Okay, I'm going to stop there so we have time for questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. A powerful summation of many teachings of the church and of society. While we invite people, please put your questions in the chat or in the question and answer place there. I'll start off with just asking you, Linda, I'm sure it was these circumstances that inspired you to write your book, but was there anything in particular that inspired you to write your book?
Well, I felt called to work with these kids. I was introduced to the experience of working with them by a friend of my husband's and mine, who was a pastor in South Central at the time, and now he's one of our regional bishops. But it became a can't not do thing when I started meeting the kids, and I've learned so much from them. But I think the reason that I wrote the book was I had also felt called to go back to school, and I was getting a master's at LMU. And one of the professors there in ethics, a theological ethics professor, asked us to take issues that we were dealing with in our lives and actually run them through Catholic teaching. And when I did that, it just became very clear to me that there isn't enough teaching in our church about these great riches that we have, and maybe I had something to offer. So it kind of turned into a book.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here from Nick. Please compare and contrast the rights of the church and God's law.
Okay, well, the rights of the church was the language in the encyclical. The way that that Aquinas talked about it, there really are three kinds of law. There's human law, and we all follow human law, even though sometimes we disagree with it. There, traffic law, the laws that we humans put together in order to be able to live in a society. The next kind of law is the natural law, which we only kind of sort of observe, but it's I guess casually described, it's the way things work in God's universe and the best way for humans to behave according to God. They're not necessarily the same. Human law can be wrong, and often is wrong, and it changes and evolves. The natural law, God's way, doesn't change, but we as humans don't really perceive it clearly all the time. So our perception of it changes. And then Aquinas also said there's the eternal law, which we really don't know, but that is God. So human law, we get it wrong a lot. The church had slaves. There were many, many things that were legal in human law, but weren't morally correct, sometimes in hindsight. And we're always called to keep our eye on both and choose the good and to follow the teachings of the church. That doesn't mean that the church always gets it right either, because the church is made up of humans and it's a human institution. But the God within the church that we see in each other is part of God's law. That was probably a little too theoretical of an answer, but that's what I've got.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. From Timothy, we have the question, what is the biggest need from us to promote an accepting environment to migrants or for migrants?
Well, I'm going to ask Gary to put up my call to action slide. It's the last one, Gary. And thank you so much for asking that. I will say that I started out in this expecting, when I started doing this work, I was angry a lot. Why don't I hear homilies on this teachings? Why don't the priests talk about immigration? Why is the only thing I ever hear about abortion? That kind of sort of discontent. And then I realized we can talk about these things. All of us lay people can talk about all the issues that are being talked about in this series, including supporting women who are pregnant. We can support all the different kinds of issues, and we can talk about them ourselves. But what I've experienced is immigration is often difficult to talk about, particularly in the current polarized environment. But we can speak up. And if somebody says something hostile, we can check them, even though it's uncomfortable and it may result in discomfort all around. If somebody says something that we think is racist, we can discuss that with them. And I'm not talking about going around and correcting everyone, because that's not usually that helpful, but asking a question like, oh, why did you say that? What did you mean by that? With a sense of curiosity and compassion may start some dialogues. One thing that I've noticed is how white and not full of migrants other than European migrants my ordinary world is. So I tried to expand my world, and not just with my clients, but with people that I deal with. So talk to people, don't avoid the difficult conversations. I've also put up here in this call to action some books that I suggest. Educate yourself. Before, most people in the country will tell you we need immigration reform. But if you ask, well, what is the law right now? What's the situation now that needs to be reformed? People will say, well, I don't actually really know the law. And I just gave you a little taste of it tonight talking about asylum only, but dig into it a little bit. And here's some suggestions that you can look at to try and understand a bit more where we got to where we are. Gary, can you turn the page? Vote. Vote. And remember when you're voting that there are those who say, why not do evil that good may come? That's not the Catholic way. We're not utilitarian. That's utilitarianism, where you pick the lesser of two evils. If you think there are two evils, then you don't choose either one of them and you work toward getting better options next time. Finally, on this list, here's a list of places that I work with. All of them obviously take donations, but a number of them also provide opportunities to become involved in the lives of migrants, mostly kids, but some family issues as well. And if you're really interested, I'm easy to find. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, and my phone number is all over the internet. Reach out to me and I'll connect you with someone. Meet people who are in immigration process.
Thank you. I think we answered Meg's question. Are there resources for people of the community to look through to become involved? But she also asked, are there ways for those already involved to share their resources? So I think you said some of that, but did you want to add any more to that, Linda?
There are a great number of agencies who are working in the immigration space. And there's a lot of information available online. If you go to the Kids in Need of Defense website, you can learn a ton. The Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, I'm actually on their board, and they have a lot of volunteers. They're a bit like an organization called CASA, which you may have heard of, that provides child advocates for kids in foster care and dependency proceedings, but they do it for kids in immigration. They have a wealth of information on their website too. Catholic Charities is one of the finest providers of immigration and immigrant rights services in the country. There's lots of resources if you want to learn and if you want to help.
Okay, great, thank you. Lewis asks, the news at the border and in the detention centers has steadily grown worse. What keeps you going, Linda?
I heard a speaker today talking about how hope is a discipline. It's not just a gift, but I think about that all the time, that, wallowing in fear doesn't do me any good. And I do some of that. But I take a lot of courage from what kids are going through. And then I also have a little bit of a sense that, history is an arc, that it goes up and down. It's a really wobbly line. And things are as bad as you're reading about at the border. And we as a country are in violation of our international treaty obligations, and our administration is breaking US law. It really is as bad as it sounds. But I don't believe that this is what the majority of Americans want. And I don't believe it will stay this way forever.
Nick is asking a second question. Is the notion of access to American citizenship an issue of social justice, natural law?
I really love that question. And I actually wrote an appendix in my book about the question of citizenship. I don't actually believe that that citizenship has to do with natural law, or Catholic social teaching for that matter. I think the concept of citizenship as it exists today was a notion that didn't really exist. It was a different kind of thing when these things were written. And to some extent, my personal view is that our country needs a big discussion on what does it mean to be a citizen here. In a country where we have low voter turnouts and everybody wants to do what's best for them. And the idea that we have obligations that are the other side of rights seems to be in dispute. I think we need to have a big national conversation for a few years about what does it actually mean to be a citizen. But personally, I think the fact that citizenship is tied to certain humanitarian statuses in the law in a pretty short period of time may be counterproductive. It's kind of a controversial thing to say, but welcoming people and not having them live on pins and needles, like you're going to throw them out if they get a traffic ticket, doesn't necessarily have to lead to citizenship. I think that's something we should talk about.
I think we're at the end here. Christine, do we see any other questions? I think we've gotten most of the questions from our participants.
We've gotten all the questions that people have submitted. I'm sure there are others out there, but I don't know that we'll be able to get to them right now.
Okay. Listen, Linda, this has been something long in coming. I'm glad we finally got you here to St. Monica. A reminder to everybody that she has written a book, and let me see if I remember the title, Dignity and Justice at the Border. Am I correct? Orbis book?
Dignity and Justice, Welcoming the Stranger at Our Border.
Welcoming the Stranger at Our Border, from Orbis Books. I'm going to bring Christine back, where we want to share with everybody what our Catholic conversations are for the next 2 weeks, particularly because we have a change of date.
We do. Because there's the presidential debates are still in flux in terms of scheduling, and we were scheduled right up against them, we've decided to move our next 2 Catholic conversations. So we're going to ask you to keep the evenings of Sunday, October 18th and Sunday, October 25th open, beginning at 7:30. So if you attend the 6:30 Mass, it will not conflict with that. On the 18th, we're going to be having a session called Making the Poor a Priority, Caring for Our Community. It's an opportunity to talk with 4 really great community leaders who are doing just that. Felicia Kellum-Adams from the St. Joseph Center, John Masseri from the People Concerned, and Bruce Rankin and Genevieve Riatort from the Westside Food Bank. They are actually putting all of this into action and have ways that we can help. And then on the 25th, Dominic Janiers and Dallas, do we have our special guest confirmed for that evening?
You know what? I don't know for sure.
Well, folks, we have a potentially special guest, not that Dominic's not special. We'll keep you posted on it, but don't miss. Just be there. October 25th, we're going to be talking about the discernment process and how you can use Catholic social teaching to guide your process of deciding how you will be voting in November. So we look forward to seeing you on both of those evenings, the 18th and the 25th.
If you enjoy learning about Catholic social teaching and the justice tradition of the Catholic Church, right now at St. Monica's, we are registering for the first part of a 3-part series on faith and poverty. It is a program administered by the Just Faith Ministries out of Kentucky. It's a program we've done here for many years at St. Monica's. This is the very first part. It's an 8-week series. Information can be found right on the website, or you can contact Christine or I, and we can give you more information. It's a wonderful opportunity to learn and talk more about many of the things that we talked about tonight.
And we had one more question that we can answer. Somebody asked, is this evening that we just had available on recording? And it is. Go to our Facebook Live page, and you can watch it again, or you can forward it to other people who you think might be interested in hearing about it. So definitely available.
Okay, we're going to bring Linda back. Linda, can we bring you back just for one moment? We want to thank you again for being with us. A bravo to you. Thank you for making it here. Behind the scenes, her husband Gary has been very busy with the slideshow. And we want to thank Merrick for being our tech crew tonight. Thank you, everyone, for being with us here at Catholic Conversations. We hope to see you at the following Thursdays and Sundays, whatever days it ends up being. Thank you. Stay well and stay safe. Good night.